It's time to accelerate. Hi, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Join me as I host conversations with the leading experts in sales, marketing, sales automation, sales process, leadership, management, training, coaching, any resource that I believe to help you accelerate the growth of your sales, your business, and most importantly, you. Hello, and welcome to Accelerate. Joining me on the show today is my guest, Ron Hubsher. Ron is Managing Director of the Sales Optimization Group and author of a good book titled Closing Time, The 7 Immutable Laws of Sales Negotiation. Ron, welcome to Accelerate.
Oh, thank you, Andy. I'm really delighted to be a guest on your show, and thank you. I'm really grateful, and to all your listeners as well.
Well, a pleasure to have you on the show. So take a minute, introduce yourself, and maybe tell us how you got your start in sals.
Yeah, I'm Ron Hubsher. I run a company called the Sales Optimization Group, and we help world-class companies, typically in the Fortune 500, already with the best of the best, accelerate their sales by putting best practices into their sales organization. And the way I got my start in sales was I started a business, and I have an engineering degree by training. I'm an engineer, and I always thought that there's a best practice and a best way to sort of manufacture a sale. And so when I was younger, I read virtually every sales book I could get my hands on, and try to figure out what were the best practices so you consistently and in a repeatable process manufacture sales with consistent results.
So were you a manufacturing engineer?
No, just a regular old engineer, not particularly manufacturing, but I always thought there's sort of process and discipline and best practices and everything that can be done.
So that's oftentimes a metaphor that people use for sales as a manufacturing process, that there's inputs, which, form of leads and so on, outputs in forms of orders, and the process in between is, the manufacturing process. Do you subscribe to that point of view?
I really do, and it's kind of interesting, when you look at a manufacturing process, and we work with some manufacturers, but we do a lot more with business services and a whole bunch of other companies like software and technology. But like if you want to manufacture a good product, you got to start with the right raw materials. And if you don't have the right raw materials, you're just not going to get a great product. And that starts with qualifying your leads, and this is something I know you talk a lot about, Andy, working with the great qualified leads. So a lot of people, if someone can fog a mirror, and their pipeline is kind of small, they'll pursue that opportunity. And if they're not really in your sweet spot, you're not going to get a high efficiency, or the likelihood of manufacturing a quality sale is low. So you really want to start with qualifying leads and identifying, who we call an ideal sales fingerprint. So you could fingerprint people and see, this is exactly the kind of people who tend to buy our products and not our competitors. Mm-hmm. Start with that as your first step in the process. And then as you walk down the process, you want to make sure you're going to have a great long-term profitable relationship. So there are various stages and steps along the way.
So, one of the things that manufacturers are concerned about is productivity. Mm-hmm. And so this is really a sort of a fuzzy area, in sales, is what constitutes sales productivity? Because I certainly understand what sales performance is, but you look at productivity in the classic sense of a unit of output measured against the unit of input, right? So if you for an hour of labor I produce X amount of goods, what's the equivalent in sales?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think if you ask most VPs of sales, they'll say quota achievement, and that's two ways. That's the percentage of quota and the number of folks hitting that quota. So if you hit 100% of quota and 100% of your folks were at that 100%, that's probably the most goodness. We know through the 80-20 rule that many people don't hit their quota, and many people overperform. And then if you're lucky, or if you're okay, through that average, you'll hit your quota. So I think there's really two key dimensions to that. So it's sort of quota achievement, or a VP of sales would measure it that way, quota achievement, and then the number of people, percentage of people making that quota achievement. There's also various measures. It's actually one of the things we always talk about is, we're always taught in sales about the sales funnel, right? So there's a lot of stuff that comes in the top, mm-hmm. much smaller amount that comes out the bottom. And if you're actually really thorough about what you're thinking about, we always talk about flipping your sales funnel so that you can start with a smaller amount of materials and end up with larger deals. So in your typical sales funnel, there are some deals that you shouldn't even be working on. Like, these are just bad investments, and if we weed those out earlier on, we'd be much better off. There are other deals where this is dialed in for deal is dialed in for us. This is one we should win, and if we don't win, it's something we've done wrong. And then there are other deals where if we do work them, we could probably win them. And it's sort of allocating your time, eliminating the ones where you have no chance and be waste of time, turning those questionable deals into winnable deals, and turning those, ones that are dialed into you, making sure you win them and expand them. So you can actually have a smaller amount of inputs in the top and greater inputs that come out the bottom. Does that make sense, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody wrote a book about that called "Flipping the Funnel," which I think was sort of about that concept. So in that case though, and because one of the things that again is more prevalent these days that you see is metrics like percentage of pipeline coverage. Right. So, my pipeline needs to be 400% of my quota for the month if you're a sales manager. But that seems to sort of go against what you're just talking about with flip the funnel, which, it's a focus. And this is problematic. I see it in many cases where managers sort of have these perverse set of incentives that encourage them to have more pipeline when, as you pointed out, maybe especially in the complex sale, you're better off with fewer prospects that you can really appropriately exploit.
Right, and it's actually interesting because there's nothing wrong per se with knowing what your funnel numbers have to be. So if you close 25% of your deals, your funnel has to be 4x, which is a great sort of starting point. But you can get a little more precise. There's a sort of version 2.0 on that. And let me give you a great example. And this is a manufacturing example. We work with a paper company. They were founded in 1924, and they've been making paper the exact same way since 1924. So I think they're about 92 years old, and there's actually recipes to make paper. And to make a piece of paper, there's 14 attributes roughly, and that'll define any piece of paper, whether it's width, basis weight, the fluorocarbons that go into it, all those kinds of things. And then there's a guide that tells you, hey, I'm looking for this type of paper, and these come in huge rolls, by the way. So I'm looking for this type of paper. Here are the 5 companies that manufacture it, and it could be the most commoditized product if you let it be. So it's actually really interesting. So companies will call up and say, hey, I need this type of paper. They'll go through this guide. They'll look at the top 3 or 4 companies and have them bid versus each other. And what we always talk about is companies don't buy price, companies buy risk. And if in your sales process you can show you the least risky solution, then you've earned the right to command a price premium. And the people who buy large rolls of papers are typically called converters, and converters will take that piece of paper, they'll print a name on it, and maybe they'll chop it up. So this particular company sold, if you ever walk into one of your favorite fast food restaurants, that sandwich comes wrapped in a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. Right? And typically that piece of paper, it actually has a little bit of a wax coating on it. And it's cut into 1-inch squares, or 1 foot squares. So what will happen is the paper manufacturer will say, hey, I need, this number of tons of this type of paper, and it's going to be used to produce, wrap for sandwiches. And so the converter will take that piece of paper, chop it into 1-inch squares, print, this burger type brand on it, and then ship it out, or this Hero Shop brand, and ship it out. So you want to understand what the risk point is for that company. So the risk point isn't necessarily the piece of paper. It's the fact that when you ship that paper, if that paper breaks on the production of lines, that's tens of thousands of dollars of downtime, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or that wax buildup, and this actually happens as the paper's going through the machine, that wax buildup, causes that machine downtime. Again, that's tens of thousands of dollars. So you really want to look at who's price sensitive to that. So is this decision being made by the procurement team, or is it being made by the operational team? So you can start weeding out your prospects, who's going to make the final decision that way. And you can actually, it's really interesting. So this is a case study that we did with one of our clients. This was by a company that was bought by a private equity firm. They had about 1,500 prospects in the entire world that they could sell to.
Right.
We went through, so it's a finite universe. We went through and ranked and scored each one of their prospects based on what's an ideal sales fingerprint for us. Mm-hmm. Right? Who's likely to buy from us on a long-term basis? Oh, these guys are only price shoppers, not for us. Oh, these people, they understand the value of having a perfect roll of paper. And there are a few other attributes. So we could rank everybody in our prospect database. And I would recommend anybody do this in their pipeline, right? So you can rank your prospect according to an ideal sales fingerprint. And there's also unacceptable client profiles. So there's two metrics. So if someone's 90% ideal and it doesn't, and 0% unacceptable, well, that's an opportunity you should pursue with rigor. And if you don't win it, it's probably something you've done and done not well. There are other folks who are sort of, 10% ideal and have 50% of the red flag profile or the unacceptable customer profile. And those are people you want to get out of your pipeline quickly. So we're working with this one customer over the 80 years. I forgot the exact number of customers. I think they had about 150 customers. In 1 year's time, we took them up to 225 customers. And they grew sales 22% in their first year and another 8% and filled up their mill in their second year, just by using that simple technique of saying, let's rank and score people in our profile. So that's the kind of dramatic things that you can do. And for people who know anything about the paper business, it's really a negative growth industry. So the paper industry grows about 2% a year. And if you actually factor in inflation and things like that, it's a negative growth industry. So that's sort of an example, a real world example of a sort of, you can't get any more old line than paper manufacturing. But by putting sales discipline and process in place, you can make tremendous results. And there, it wasn't a question of, I need more pipeline. It's I need more quality folks. And that's always a good second screen. So typically, you need 3x or 4x your quota to be in your pipeline. But if you really scratch it away, you need less than that, but you need the right type. Because you can have 5 or 6x of really bad folk, and it doesn't matter. Or you can have 3x, and you'll more than make your quota.
Now, in those cases, were you finding that the ultimate deal sizes that they were getting were larger?
Absolutely, because people understood the value that they were delivering. And they would get, in some businesses, it's winner take all. In some businesses, you get a piece of the pie. So in sort of dual source or tri-source businesses, you end up getting 90% of the pie, right? And in single source businesses, you get 100% of the pie. And people are ordering more materials, and then they get more customers. So that one converter who sold sandwich wraps to chain X, Y, and Z, they added on other chains due to the quality of their success. So that goes back to the manufacturer or the paper who ends up getting bigger and bigger orders. So you're helping your customers be successful as well.
But interestingly, you're describing a situation that you had sort of less coverage in the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
You were closing a higher fraction of the deals, and the deals that you closed were larger.
Correct.
So, if you take that back and look at that from sort of a manufacturing point of view, right? Because your paper company client right there, I would imagine that one of their key metrics that they were doing in manufacturing was, footage of paper that they were producing per hour.
Correct. So something along those lines, yes.
All right. So why in sales don't we measure amount of revenue produced per hour by rep? Per hour meaning per hour of selling time.
Yeah, you could absolutely do that.
But why don't people? Because to me, that's productivity. You described a situation where you actually were just increasing their productivity, where I presume without adding any headcount and by being more targeted on the accounts you're selling to, you're closing a higher fraction, producing greater revenues. So obviously, the amount of revenue produced by hour of selling time went up fairly substantially.
Correct. Absolutely.
So that's productivity. Productivity to me, productivity has nothing to do with attaining quota. That's performance. What I want to know is, and what I think is the great gap with many sales leaders and most sales leaders, is they don't understand this whole fraction about how many dollars of revenue is each rep producing per hour of sales time.
Right, and I understand if you're a VP of sales because that's not how you're measured. I mean, I completely agree with you in improving productivity, but they're always measured by quota. So, by improving productivity, you're going to net increase one, over performance of quota, and 2, the number of people hitting quota. So
and you then understand really what your true capacity is within the resources you have for attaining a certain revenue number.
Right, and if you actually think about how revenue numbers are assigned, or quotas typically assigned, it's sort of like, we need to hit this year, right? Here's the number. We need to grow 10 or 15%, right? So I'm going to give that to you, Mr. or Miss VP of Sales. Ms. or Miss VP of Sales is going to dish out that additional quota plus a markup. So just in case they don't make it, the company still hits their quota. So they may assign, plus 25% to their team, and then they'll allocate it in different ways. And that's typically how it's assigned. It's sort of assigned by, this is what the business needs to do, as opposed to where can we improve productivity improvements? What are we strategically doing to improve the productivity? It's, here's the number we got to hit because that's what we got to do. So I completely agree with you, Andy.
Okay. Well, yeah, you didn't have to agree with me, but it's just like, this is something I've talked about. People in the audience probably are tired of hearing me bring this up, maybe to some degree, but it to me, it's the next real frontier in terms of how we manage sales. See, I worked in a business, had the fortune when I was much younger in my career, and I was managing sales teams where I had the information because we worked in sort of defense business, or part of the company's defense business, and we had to track everybody's time, including sales reps, by hour, what they're working on, by project number, by time, to the half-hour increment. So I knew exactly,
And
to sort of a half hour, how many sales hours required to close $1 million deal.
Right. And it's interesting. I always sort of say sales is the last undisciplined functional area, right? We can manufacture things to within a millimeter, but when you try to manufacture a sale, there's so much variance on it. And you can look at the same people selling the same products to the same customers, and one person can have a 50% close rate and someone can have a 10% close rate on opportunities per sold. And same thing with discounting, right? The same people selling the same products to the same customers. One person will have a 50% discount rate, someone will have a 0% discount rate. So completely agree. There's a lot of upside potential when you put process and discipline into sales.
Oh yeah, and an upside in terms of generating more revenues with existing resources. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about sales negotiation, because this is, you've written the book, Closing Time, the 7 Immutable Laws of Sales Negotiation. I think it's sort of interesting. So where does selling end and negotiation begin?
And that's a great question. So to me, they're interrelated. Negotiation starts at the very first interaction and sometimes before the first interaction. And you always want to think about closing with the first interaction you have with a customer. I always think there's the overt negotiation and the covert negotiation. So the overt negotiation is, boy, we get down to this contract and we got terms and conditions, we got pricing, we got a whole bunch of stuff, right? I put my thing on the table and now we're negotiating pricing terms, right? So that's sort of the overt negotiation. But everything you do before then is as or much more important as you go down the sales process. So you really want to be thinking about your negotiation strategy as you go through your sales strategy. And what I always talk about is that there's two things you need to negotiate well. The first is you have to put a superlative sales effort in. No amount of negotiation prowess can make up for a poor sales effort. But just because you put a strong sales effort in doesn't mean you'll negotiate well. It creates the potential to negotiate well. If you combine that with a strong negotiation plan, you'll capitalize on that potential. If you have a weak or non-existent plan, you'll squander that potential. And if you put a poor sales effort in, there's no negotiation prowess, there's no magic abracadabra that I can tell you that'll make up for a poor sales effort. So two things for negotiation success are, one is you have to put a superlative sales effort in, and two, you have to have a negotiation plan.
Okay, but you said that negotiation starts at the beginning. So
correct.
I'm prospecting. Where am I negotiating?
You'll be negotiating through the entire sales process, but the biggest thing, and the single biggest mistake is that salespeople make, especially in business-to-business sales, is they're not sure they're the buyer's number one choice. So in a business-to-business sale, typically you'll be competing with 2, 3, 4, 5 other competitors. It's a considered purchase, right? And you'll want to definitely ascertain and make yourself the number one choice. And if you're not the number one choice, you're really negotiating to beat down the price of the real winner, your competition. So what you always want to do is sell to be the number one choice. And if you're not the number one choice, don't negotiate, because they're really using you to beat down the price of the real winner. And if you're the number one choice, you want to think about how you're going to command a price premium, how you're going to deliver even more value to that customer and make this deal even more profitable for you and more profitable for your client or your prospect.
So what's that look like? I mean, again, you're a sales rep, you're at the beginning stages of just engaging and contacting, connecting with the prospect. So tell the audience what that means relative to when you said, negotiations sort of start at that end. That's that early in the deal. What are you saying to the customer? What actions are you taking that sort of exemplify that?
Right. So, there are things you're going to want to ascertain, sort of, you're going to want to know, what is the value of solving this problem to the customer? What's going to happen if it doesn't get solved? You're going to want to quantify and create an ROI or payback value for them. You're going to want to talk about the things that make you unique and how you help lower that buyer's risk. And what we always talk about is companies don't buy price, companies buy risk. And if in your sales process you can show you the least risky solution, then you've earned the right to command a price premium. So you're going to want to understand their pain points, understand how you can lower their risk, what the value of a solution is going to look like, what the value of not implementing a solution is going to look like, so you don't lose to no competition. You're going to want to know the buying process. You're going to want to know the personal agendas of each of the buying folks, if you can. These are some of the basic things that you're going to want to know. You're going to want to know the decision-making process. You want to know any kind of compelling event that's going to happen. And you're going to want to feel comfortable presenting a price premium to them later on at the end of the day.
Sure. Well, I think I misunderstood what you'd said earlier. So what you just said made a lot of sense. So what we're going to focus on is we're going to focus on taking the actions that position us to negotiate from a position of strength.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay. So make sure, sell a superlative sales effort to make sure we are the number one choice. Mm-hmm. Reduce risk, which I talk about in my first book as being absolutely essential to selling. The other factors you brought up is understanding their needs, their wants, the value they're going to receive, doing the financial calculation, all that, if agreed to, and as I said, as part by the prospect, they got the buy-in as you go through, then you set yourself up for, but again, negotiating more from a position of strength.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay. Got it. All makes sense. Good.
Right. So, we always talk about is everything that we teach complements a sales process they may have in place. Some companies have a well-defined sales process, though that's few and far between. Most have a sort of a loosely defined sales process these days. It typically complements what they're already doing. There's nothing that I sort of mentioned there that would be shocking or surprising to any seasoned sales representative.
So one thing that's, again, sort of back to an example I gave before, that's sort of interesting, get your perspective on this, is as we see more and more products, and even some of the clients that you mentioned, I know, are making the shift to products they previously sold maybe as a capital expense, now are sold as part of a service, mm-hmm. right? A subscription-based service. It seems like that takes away some of that price negotiation.
When you say takes away the price of negotiation, tell me more, Andy.
Well, I mean, if you're selling something for $200 a seat per month, as opposed to this is $1 million thing that you're going to buy, because a lot of the contracts put together, it's like, hey, press hard 3 copies. This is a set price standard. We don't have a lot of room for negotiation now that this is a service we're providing, as opposed to when it's some capital expense. I mean, are you seeing some of that?
So I think, what I see in the B2B software as a service space is people still want the same discounts, and they want 40 to 50%, and they're going to press you on that. If you have standard pricing, that's totally fine. I have no problem with that. But, if you look at some of the most notable software as a service names out there, they discount, 20, 30, 40, 50% all the time. That's not unusual. And depending on the size of the deal, even though it's delivered as software as a service, it may be paid for differently. So if you're working a really large deal, it might be a multi-million-dollar deal. So that certainly doesn't change. The way the application is delivered change, but the way you may pay for it may not be changed. May not be changed. So they may want 5 years up front or a portion of it up. And then for sort of smaller users, your onesie twosies, there may or may not be pricing flexibility, but certainly everyone's going to ask.
Well, how does the negotiation strategy change if you're selling in a SaaS model versus the more conventional model that existed before for software?
It's really interesting, Andy. It's sort of like every negotiation, sort of like every human being, has the same amount of muscles and has the same number of bones. I forgot the number. I think it's 206 bones in your body, or 86 muscles. So whether you're, if you want someone who's left-handed and has a chapeau, that infrastructure doesn't change. So every negotiation goes through the same 7 steps, just how you customize them and configure them will vary a little bit.
Okay,
But,
so briefly, what are those 7 steps of sales negotiation?
yeah, so the first is you have to be the buyer's number one choice, as we sort of talked about before. And we talk about companies don't buy price, companies buy risk. And if in your sales process you can show you the least risky solution, then you've earned the right to command a price premium. And even if you're selling, and what I always look for and what I try and scrub people from my pipeline, I want to get to the guy who has risk. And if someone doesn't have risk, they can be a commodity buyer. And I never want to sell to a commodity buyer. So if someone calls you up and the first thing they're asking about price is you got to walk it back and talk about, well, what are your issues? What are you trying to accomplish? If someone doesn't feel risk, like, oh, hey, if I buy this software as a service as opposed to the other one and it fails, I feel no pain, I never want to sell to that person, ever, because they're just going to go right to the bottom, right? So you always want to be the buyer's number one choice. You want to know the value you create. If you don't know the value you create, you're going to be left in defend price. And that's going to put you in a reactive and negative negotiation position. So Andy, if I talk to you about, let's say we're selling something $200 a month, and I know if this thing's going to bring you $10,000 worth of value, right, each month, I go, look, we can talk about, whatever the number is, Andy, we can talk about whether, you buy this for $100 or $200, it's going to take us 3 months of negotiation to go back and forth over this. It's going to take a lot of time. I'm going to have to go to my VP. We're going to have to go through legal. We're going to have to do 18 different things. By the time we get it solved, right, even if we were to give you $100 a month, and I'm not saying we will, and I don't know what we'd want back in return, whether it's complete payment up front, longer term commitment, we might want a whole bunch of other things. You're already losing out on $40,000. Is it worth losing out on $40,000 to save $100 a month, right? So you always want to talk about the value you create. And that's one of the biggest mistakes people don't do, is they don't know the value you create. So they're left to defend price.
Or cost, right? Right.
You're talking about cost, and that can get down to zero pretty quickly. And there's always someone there who's willing to undercut you. So you have to know the value you create. And actually, a lot of our clients, when they start using our negotiation methodology, they get really firm about talking about the value they create. So only about 5% of companies that we know of typically have an ROI calculator, and less than that actually use it. And typically, when we work with them, that number is greatly increased. And you have to be able to, even if it's on the back of an envelope, you always have to talk about value. And the way we talk about value to our customers is we talk about what a 5, 10, 15% reduction in discounting will do to your share price. So for every client we do a share price calculator that says, hey, if you reduce discounting by 5%, you can increase your share price by $40. Right, or whatever the number comes out, depending on that particular organization. Right. So, we always practice what we preach. So you have to know the value you create. You have to be prepared to resist squeezes. Know they're coming, look forward to them. And in fact, be disappointed if someone doesn't squeeze you, right? Anybody worth their salt's going to squeeze you in a business-to-business sales negotiation. So you want to be prepared to resist squeezes.
Go ahead. So here's a sort of a structural question for you, because this is something that I see. I wouldn't say it necessarily in an increasing number of companies, but you see it from time to time. Certainly, it's an environment I worked in for a while, which was that once the negotiation really started, sales was no longer a part of that. There was contracts or legal or somebody that was doing the negotiation. So, what are you seeing out there? What do you recommend?
Yeah, and you want to know the decision-making process up front. So, when you're working with your economic buyer, whatever it is, you're going to want to be a team. You're going to go and want to ask them, what obstacles can get in the way.
But the point was, I saw it to me, and my experience has been, it's more of a serial process. I mean, companies, given the tightness of resources, not to say they haven't, and I've certainly been in situations this happened, but it's very rare where companies are negotiating simultaneously with 2 competitors. I mean, real contract negotiations.
Right.
I mean, isn't that what you see? I mean, to me, it's like, gosh, decision gets made subject to a final contract, but they make a decision on one party and then move forward with one party. And if the negotiations don't work out, they'll go to the next one, but they won't invest the effort to go simultaneously. I mean, what are you seeing in that regard?
Yeah, so there's always a backup, absolutely, but there's also always a number one choice. And you want to make sure you're that number one choice. And there's 2 parts to serial. One is with other companies, and the other is within that company, right? So you're going to want to know, is this going to go through procurement? Is this going to go through legal? Of course, it's going to go through legal and procurement in most large organizations. What are they going to be looking for? What do we need to make them happy, and how can we bring them on earlier on? So as you get into larger deal sizes, you talked about earlier, Andy, if you're going to go through procurement, what are they going to need? What are they going to look for? How can we engage them? How can we make them look good? And you want to think about those things in advance, so you're not going to get it down to, hey, this deal is worth X or this number of dollars per user per month, and then they get to procurement, they're like, oh, you're going to have to reduce that 30%. And everyone throws up their hands. Well, it's procurement, you got to just do that. You're going to want to really be proactive. And actually, that's one way of differentiating yourself during the sales process, of understanding the decision-making process and all the parties involved, and knowing how you can create a competitive advantage. And if you're working with procurement and you're working with legal, and they're going seriously with another competitor, you can understand where you are in the decision-making process. So if you're getting access to their legal and you're getting access to procurement, you're probably at a better position than that other company. And I also like asking my clients, take price out of the issue. If price were an issue, would we be your number one choice? Why or why not? Mm-hmm. And that way I always want to differentiate what we're doing.
Okay, perfect. Now we get to the last segment of the show. I've got some standard questions I ask every guest. Audience always anxious to hear what people have to say with this one. So in this first question, it's a hypothetical scenario that you, Ron, have just been hired as a VP of sales at a company whose sales have hit a rough patch. They sort of stalled out, slumped a little bit. CEO is anxious to get things turned around and unstuck. So your first week on the job, what two things would you do that could have the biggest impact?
So I think there's two things. Well, one, you always want to assess the sales talent. And if it's an old team or an established team, you're going to want to assess, what you got on your team and where you can help them improve. And then two, I want to make sure they're working on the best opportunity. So I create an ideal sales fingerprint and an unacceptable client profile, and we scrub the pipeline. So we see right away what we have working on and where we're going. So those are the two biggest things that I would try and do, is sort of assessing where we are and how we're going to get to where we go.
Okay. And you just won the award for answering that question the fastest. So,
I've been there.
Yeah, you've been there, right? So, okay. So now some rapid fire questions. You can give me one-word answers or elaborate if you wish. So the first one is, when you, Ron, are out selling your services, what's your most powerful sales attribute?
I think there's a couple things. Our biggest thing is our referenceable client base. We bring out some pretty heavy-hitting names, and it opens people's eyes. So I think that's our biggest competitive advantage. Two, I think our sales process is very thorough, and we walk the walk. So a lot of times when clients bring us in, they go, the reason we chose them is because they put the best sales effort in, and they really walk through everything they have in their book.
Okay.
Those are the two biggest attributes.
All right. Who's your sales role model?
Sales role model. Well, I have a couple people who I always call my sales rock stars. Alston Gardner, who founded Taz, Mike Bosworth, Solution Selling, Bob Miller Hyman. Those are my three big rock stars, and I got to speak and meet all three of those guys.
Excellent. Okay. One book besides your own that every salesperson should read.
I would say Miller Hyman, Solution Selling, or the original Mike Bosworth. Mike Bosworth, Solution Selling, or the original, both original Miller Hyman, Strategic Selling.
Okay. Yeah, Michael Bosworth, guest on the show previously. And last question. So what music's on your playlist these days?
I'm stuck in the 90s and 80s, so U2 is probably my biggest one, and a little Hendrix thrown in, which would put me in the 60s as well.
Okay, U2 and Hendrix. Okay, that's a good mix. I like that. Well, good. Well, Ron, thanks for being on the show. Tell folks how they can connect with you.
You can connect with me if you go to our website, www.salesog, as an optimization group, or originalgangster.com.
That gangster part, okay.
Gives a different image of myself.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Or just send me an email at rhubsher, H-U-B as in boy, S-H-E-R, so that's rhubsher, H-U-B as in boy, S-H-E-R, @salesog.com.
Great. Well, good, Ron. Thanks again for being on the show. And remember, friends, thank you for taking the time to listen to Accelerate today. And remember, make it a part of your day every day to deliberately learn something new to help you accelerate your success. And one easy way to do that is take a minute and subscribe to this podcast, Accelerate. And that way you won't miss any of my conversations with top business experts like my guest today, Ron Hubsher, who shared his expertise about how to accelerate the growth of your business. So thanks for joining me. And until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone. Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard and want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher.com. For more information about today's guest, visit my website at andypaul.com.